Hi, everybody, and welcome to this conversation about the questions around God and faith that most keep you up at night here with Dr. Tom Oord. I recently surveyed a lot of my readers to ask them which of these 10 questions that Tom and Dr. Tripp Fuller found through an extensive survey that they took are the ones that are the most salient for you, the questions that keep you up at night, have you wondering whether you belong in the Christian family or having religious belief or even spiritual practice at all. And the questions that rose to the top are very interesting. And so really wanting to talk to you today with Dr. Tom Oord. I like to think of Tom as the internet's theologian in a lot of ways.
Oh, that's nice. I'll take that title. Thanks.
I really feel like over the last, gosh, probably like 15 years, you have slowly and steadily put yourself out there online in terms of how accessible you are and
Mm,
how, you are obviously an academic theologian. You oversee people's doctoral work, but you also keep a very pastoral pulse on
mm.
what is going on in the hearts and minds of people. And I feel like this whole God After Deconstruction project that you're doing with Tripp really exemplifies just how much you care about the questions that people are asking and giving them an alternative to the sort of fundamentalist and Christian nationalist answers that are really poisoning the well and turning a lot of people off from faith in general.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, I made a decision a little more than 20 years ago that I was going to try to be both an academic theologian and we would now call it a public or a popular theologian and write books for both audiences. And I've tried to do that over that last 20 years. And it's actually pretty tough because you have to learn to switch language. You have to think about what questions really matter to what people. But it's an honor and privilege that you would give me that title, because I do spend a lot of time on the internet, not only on podcasts like the one we're doing now, but I try really hard to respond to people's social media messages, because I think people are asking big questions like the ones we're going to explore today.
Absolutely. You are so accessible on social media. And I think it's really important. I see the work that you're doing and the work that Tripp are doing alike as such a welcome alternative to what I feel like, coming of age in like early 2000s evangelicalism, where the most prevalent theological education, if we could even call it that, it was by these sort of, charismatics, Pentecostals, evangelical folks who were entering into new media landscapes, just like they pioneered television broadcasting
Yeah.
before with like the Pat Robertsons and the Jerry Falwells. And what I see now is that finally more progressive and contemplative Christian voices are catching up and in some ways surpassing in terms of what's being made accessible. So kudos
Yeah.
to
Well,
being
oh,
a
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
oh no, I was just say kudos to you for being a public theologian. And yeah, there you
Oh, well, thanks. There's a price to pay for that, however. So the price is in evangelical, Pentecostal, more conservative circles. If you're out in the public square and saying things that don't fit with what the people with the money or the majority of power have, then you're likely to lose your job. And I lost my job, and there's been lots of other people who've lost their jobs. But I knew early on that that was a possibility, and I thought it was worth the risk, because the alternative would be to keep ideas I think can really help people, to keep them to myself or keep them to the cloistered academics. And that didn't seem to me like my calling. So I wanted to get these ideas not only out in the world, but in bite size or accessible language. And that has gotten me in trouble.
Yeah, it absolutely has you and so many others. But like you're saying, the cost of silence would be even worse. And I feel
I
like,
think so.
yeah, yeah. And I feel like for decades now, increasing exit of people from the pews of traditional churches, even in mainline denominations, what a lot of people say is like, my pastor learned these things in seminary, but felt like they couldn't teach them from the pulpit and have, dumbed things down. And now I feel betrayed because
Yeah.
the only messages I've received are, these very watered down party line towing things, which, as we're seeing, have paved the way to a lot of complacency and a lot of, rise of outright fascism in our pulpits and in faith communities around the country.
Yeah, and some anti-intellectualism as well. There's the academic elites, as they're oftentimes called, or as I'm oftentimes called. Uh,
You were saying,
and
yeah.
yeah, I don't feel like an elite. I do feel like I take the life of the mind seriously,
Yeah.
but what the average person in the pew, there's been a disservice to them, because so many of the pastors do know that the issues are more complex. The answers are not as cozy, maybe, as people would like. They're a little prickly, maybe. And yet many leaders, because they might lose their jobs, they choose to keep those things kind of under their hats. Bart Ehrman does a really good job of criticizing Christian leaders for going to seminary, learning these sophisticated ways of reading scripture, and then going back to the local church and never talking about them again.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
and that causes real problems.
Yeah, it does. And I get the temptation in many ways. Like,
Yes.
all, and even from a good faith perspective, all ministers are translators, right? Popularizers. Even me, as an author who seeks to popularize scholarship I appreciate, knows not to go down every single rabbit trail and pick every single minutia, because the average person doesn't care. But there's a fine line between faithfully translating ideas in a big picture way, and yeah, intentionally withholding things that could feel uncomfortable, and then unfortunately create a laity, which I don't even like that word, but they create a laity that then expects really simplistic stuff. So over the course of several generations, you have just successive dumbing down, kind of like the movie Idiocracy, but applied to church and spirituality.
Yeah, that's well put. Just because we're going down this road, when I was in pastoral ministry, I had a strategy that I tried to deal with this. And my strategy was, I tried to pinpoint people in my congregation or youth group when I was a youth pastor who I thought were academically either mature or just had more academic chops. And I tried to work with them on one-on-one or small groups to tackle these big questions, so that they at least had new alternatives, knew the Bible had errors and how to deal with it and that sort of thing. uh, I wasn't brave enough to say everything that I thought from the pulpit. Maybe brave is not the right word. Maybe I should say I was smart enough not to say everything I thought from the pulpit, because I really thought that a good chunk of the audience wasn't ready for those ideas. And so part of, I think, the wisdom of a leader is trying to gauge the audience and then meet people where they're at, even if that means meeting them in private settings in which they can be more we'll tackle those tougher questions with more direct answers.
That's a really wise strategy. And if there are any ministers tuning in, and I know there will be, that's a good tip, a way to, yeah, help prepare your congregation by dealing with some of the folks who are maybe the most open-minded and open-hearted first.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Well, let's dive in. I want to, first share, for the purposes of this recording, what the top 10 questions were, and then we're going to focus on 3 of these today, but we'll also share how you can explore all 10 if you're someone watching and you're interested. So the questions that rose to the top when, you were seeking out what are the challenges that people are feeling. This was my phrasing of the 10 questions. 1, can God be all loving and all powerful at the same time? Who or what then is responsible for evil? 2, how do I live a life of adventurous faith without absolute certainty? 3, can I still revere scripture if it contains inconsistencies and problematic perspectives? 4, how can I trust in God and participate in faith communities given the tragedy of abuse in the church? 5, how can I embody a countercultural faith in light of rising Christian nationalism and the worship of power over love? 6, what about evolution? Can I see faith and science as allies in the search for truth? 7, can I recover a vibrant faith on the other side of religious discrimination against women and LGBTQ plus folks? 8, can I affirm the wisdom found in other faith traditions while being rooted and grounded in the way of Jesus? 9, can faith traditions actually help reverse our runaway climate catastrophe, or do they only hurt the cause of ecological healing? And finally, 10, is an open-hearted, wide-awake faith sufficient to rediscover purpose on the other side of deconstruction?
Those
So,
are beautifully put.
thank you. Yeah, yeah. I took some of the raw data that Tripp gave me, and that was my formulation of the questions that I put out there. And so the clear majority, when I surveyed my 80,000 readers, the one that they most wanted to hear your response to is, how can I embody a countercultural faith in light of rising Christian nationalism and the worship of power over love? We see this ramping up in this next election season, more and more, not just at the top. Yesterday, I watched a clip that was highlighted of some new evangelical thought leader who was straight-faced and soberly saying why he thinks that women's suffrage is the worst threat to a Christian nation, and how he really wants to take away women's right to vote because it divides households and disrupts the God-ordained flow of authority from man to
Wow.
women and children. And when you hear these things, like they're coming out of the Handmaid's Tale, and they're being, they're being propped up as this sort of cultural Christianity. Even Richard Dawkins this week has said that he is a cultural Christian because he wants to stem the tide of Islam, encroaching the world. So this isn't just an American phenomenon. There is this sort of resurgence of what you and I and my readers would consider all the worst reasons to be a Christian, to be a Christendom supporter. And yet that's what the life raft of a lot of folks are clinging on to. So how can we be countercultural friends of God and followers of Jesus? Should we just give the fundies and the nationalists the name, or is it worth fighting for? And if so, why? What's in it for us?
Yeah, well, my response is probably going to strike some people as a bit weird, at least at first.
Okay. Love it.
My response is that there are theological assumptions at play by most Christian nationalists that lead them in directions that I think produce harm. But many progressive Christians share the same theological commitment, but don't see how it can be harmful on the other side. And that commitment is namely the belief that God either is in control or can control anyone or anything at any time, what most people call omnipotence, or God being all powerful or sovereign. And you can see this explicitly in the Christian nationalists, major leaders, as they talk about, it's God's will for this, that, and the other. You can't, it's always convenient for them talking about how you're not supposed to oppose leaders when those leaders agree with their view. But then when they get a leader in who doesn't agree, all of a sudden that language doesn't come out. But because they think that America, at least American Christian nationalists, they're nationalists in all kinds of different settings, but in terms of America, because these folks think that the United States is God's favorite child, and where this country has been chosen by God, and God is in control of things, then they can impose all kinds of hierarchical views of what a society and structure is like in the name of God. It must be God, what God wants, or at least allows. And the reason that I want to criticize progressives on this is that a lot of progressive Christians I know have a progressive social agenda. They care about climate change. They think there's a place for abortion. They're into, supporting minorities, Black Lives Matters, all the kind of the classic progressive Christian approaches, and yet they want to hold on to that divine omnipotence. They may believe in free will, but they still believe that God occasionally will intervene to fix something. But if you go down that path, then you have to say that God allowed Donald Trump to be president. God allows abuse God allows all kinds of the negative things that goes on in the world because God, if God is omnipotent, could have stopped it. So the beginning of my answer to your question about Christian nationalism is actually a theological claim that I don't believe God is omnipotent, and we can make real headway in this conversation if we give up on that omnipotence idea.
Yes, it's a provocative claim, and it gets right into your wheelhouse of open and relational theology. So let me ask, like, okay, well, gosh, if I'm wanting to embody a countercultural faith, I do have this social vision. Maybe I do end up having the same default assumption as the Christian nationalists that, yeah, that God is sovereign, God is in control. And but if not, like, isn't the alternative pretty depressing? Then why pray? Am I not praying for God to change outcomes? Is it strictly this humanist sort of flatland approach where it's just people power, it's only what we're doing? How does God function then, if not in a way of being all in control?
Yeah. Let me answer that by first giving a nice little catchphrase and then explaining it. Here's my little catchphrase answer. God is not omnipotent nor impotent, but God is omnipotent. So let me explain what I mean by that. I
Unpack.
do I do think you're right that people, once they see that there's problems with omnipotence, the alternative they imagine is a God who does nothing, who sits up on Mars eating popcorn, looking down and saying, "Sucks to be you guys, figure it out on your own." And I don't think that is not only a good picture of a loving God, but not a picture of a God who's really active in our lives and in the world. So I think the God who is a spirit at work in all of the universe is the most strongest and most influential, but never in a controlling way. And our hopes for a better tomorrow rely on God's uncontrolling love and creaturely responses. It's not all on us, it's not all on God. There has to be a symbiotic connection, a synthesis, a working together in a cooperating manner. And so I think we do have hope because this God of relentless love is active everywhere at all times in every heart, but some people don't respond well to it. But you and I can be called to be a part of this partnership God is calling all of creation to. And that's where the heart of the hope lies.
Mm.
Oh, I forgot to explain omnipotence. Let me add that one in real quick. Yeah, omnipotence is spelled Amipotence. And if you've never heard of that word, don't think we're snoring in the middle of theology class. It's a word I made up a year ago.
It's all good theological terms. Someone had
that's,
some.
that's right. So ami is the Latin word for love. Potens is the word for power or influence. And my claim is that God's power is the power of uncontrolling love. Love comes first in God, and we should understand God's power in light of this love, which I want to claim is inherently uncontrolling.
Mm, mm. Yeah, and I think that, if this idea at first sounds weird to folks, consider if you ever read and enjoyed the novel The Shack. I would say
Mm,
that The Shack portrays,
yeah.
directly addressing the problem of evil, a God who is, the most moved mover, the God who is relational love, who is certainly active and at work, but also is, very much implicated in creation rather than standing out and above it. And therefore, the central tragedy of the novel, which I won't name in case you're one of 5 people that hasn't read it, could even unfold or happen. And that if we took that perspective more seriously, um, yeah, it could really move the needle. And
Yeah, I think in The Shack, Paul Young does a really great job of laying out options and choosing to reject the kind of typical responses you hear to the problem of evil, that God is in control, omnipotent, whatever.
yeah.
Paul doesn't ever kind of come out directly and say something that I'm willing to directly say, and
Mhm.
that is that God simply can't prevent evil single-handedly.
Hmm.
You could read the shack and you might think that God could, but chooses not to, that God won't always stop evil. You could go either way, but I've tried to be very clear on this to say, I think we should make that next step and say, there's something about the way God is, that God's love is uncontrolling, that makes it the case that God can't prevent not only evils done by free will creatures, but natural evils, viruses, chance, and random events, because God can't control anyone or anything.
Hmm. Yeah. Paul, if you're watching this, happy to have you on for a response. And
Yes, that'd be great.
and yes, that's a beautiful point to just be clear about and consistent about, because I think it could be a balm to so many hearts who wonder, like, even looking at the current unfolding tragedy in Gaza, like,
Yeah.
where is God? And to conceive that God could, but God isn't because of God's inscrutable purposes is unconscionable. And it
Mm.
can still be tricky and pastorally and existentially dizzying to consider the possibility that God can't. There's a lot more that could be said about that, but folks can consult literally your entire body of work to dive in more, including the book
Yeah,
God Can't. So,
that's true. I feel like, though, I got us off track a little from your question, which was on Christian nationalism. Can I take a one more stab at that and kind of give
of
a more
course.
practical thing?
Yep.
Um, you know, I am not a fan of Donald Trump, and I'm a strong opponent of Christian nationalism. But I have friends and family members who see things differently, and so I feel like sometimes I'm right in the mix of things in trying to figure out the best way to handle these relationships that really matter to me in a way that I think is with integrity and promotes the love of God as I understand it. And for me, that means being very blunt about things I think are wrong in a candidate like Donald Trump, or wrong about a understanding of America as somehow God's special one and other countries aren't as special, or that God is in control of what's happening. I'm very blunt about that in those conversations, not in an attacking way, but I just want to say I just think that's the wrong way to think. Um, and then if my conversation partner wants to know my alternative, I'm willing to share it. But I try to discern the situation and knowing how much I should share from my own sort of views on things. uh, I do, though, try to be sure, because most people have an either or thinking. They think that if it's not Donald Trump, then it has to be Joe Biden, or even worse, Donald Trump is bad, Joe Biden is good in every way. And I try to make sure to tell people, although I think I'm going to vote for Biden over Trump, it's not because I think Biden is the great president of our time. It's because there are other options out there too. And if you think another candidate's a better way to go for it.
Yeah.
But just criticizing Trump doesn't necessarily mean you have to vote for Biden.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes I feel like when it comes to our mainstream two-party politics, we're in a race to the bottom of who is articulating less original ideas and less of a
Yeah.
proactive vision for our country. The better ideas are almost always at the margins with third-party candidates, and
Yep.
it's really depressing how our system is set up. And I think that's why we need ranked choice voting. But that's a whole
I
other.
like that idea, but yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. I think that is a great pausing point on that question. And another question that received a lot of attention from my readers is, can faith traditions actually help reverse our runaway climate catastrophe, or do they only hurt the cause of ecological healing?
Yeah, well, since I talked about omnipotence in the last answer, I'm going to set that aside, although I think that's an important part of this.
Yeah,
And there's lots of folks who, climate change deniers, who appeal to an omnipotent God to say, if God really cares about the climate, the warming climate, then God would stop it. But I'm going to set the omnipotence one aside just for a moment
yeah.
and focus on another idea that is widely held in the open and relational theological community. And that is the idea that not just humans, but all creation has intrinsic value. That means that the other creatures, the bugs, the dirt, the water is not just valuable for what it can do for us, that's instrumental value, but it has value in and of itself. Now, faith communities, especially the ones that are in the Abrahamic traditions, have wanted to say that there is a God, and I agree with that, who is a creator, and I agree with that as well. And this God created creation good. It has intrinsic value. At least that's one way to interpret the Genesis passages. And that's not just Jews and Christians, that's Muslims as well. And that means, it seems to me, that faith communities have some theological, conceptual framework to care for what happens on the planet, not just themselves, not just their human neighbors, but their animal neighbors and all creatures. Now, whether or not they'll actually act on that caring is another question, and there's another number of things we might do to motivate them. But in terms of theologically, I think if we bring back in the Abrahamic traditions, the notion that God is a good and loving God who creates a good creation. Yes, it's got problems, but God cares for not only you and me, but also the sparrows. That is a theological motivation for folks of at least the Abrahamic faith traditions to get on board with fighting climate disaster and climate change.
Uh, yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I feel like the two greatest enemies to that within the Abrahamic traditions, and specifically the Christian tradition, is one, interpreting like the early Genesis mandate as dominion, and to then further interpret dominion as instrumentality, to simply use the resources that we have for our benefit, which ends up being applied in a very short-sighted way, especially under capitalism, where extractive economies are wanting to extract the worst. So when we pair that with some really shoddy eschatology, end times views that basically reinforce this idea of the planet as a transitory resource that's literally going to burn and get replaced one day, and so we're like a cosmic scrap heap, we end up with like a dilemma in I think what has become a lot of our popular religion.
Yeah, I'm in 100% agreement with you on those 2 points as well. I won't elaborate, but yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, so I'm with you that, like, yeah, a way to sort of theologically and spiritually resource our imaginations and our will to change would be, yeah, looking at that original mandate of creation as being good, and like you were alluding to, Jesus' reiteration of that about considering the lilies of the field and
Yeah.
embracing
You
embracing
know,
goodness.
this brings up a book that I've been reading in the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's called Resonance by Hartmut Rosa. Are you familiar with that name at all?
Tell us about it.
He's a German sociologist, and he's got one book that's like, super thick and it's very academic, and then another one that's nice and thin that gives the same point in more accessible ways.
Um,
But he sort of basically looks at using philosophy, even some theology, but mostly sociology, psychology, and philosophy. Says that at the heart of the modern problem is the desire for increased growth, and that capitalism is a way to say we always have to go faster, harder, have more. And that ends up making us feeling alienated. Or the word he likes to use is our relationships with the world and others are muted.
mm,
And he wants to say we need to have a resonant, is his favorite word, a
mm,
resonant relationship with others and our world. And he just sort of lays out his case. But at the heart, I said, is this notion that we think our not only our GDP as nations, but our communities and our personal lives is about the accumulation and getting more and more stuff and things and more this, that, and the other.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a powerful point. I do think that our culture of acquisitiveness is directly tied to a numbing out or a sense of alienation, like we're not feeling connected. And
Yes.
one way in my own work that I've described that is that, I would say that an existential problem that humans have faced at least since the agricultural revolution, that's only become more intensified through the industrial revolution and through now our late stage capitalism, is a sense of fourfold alienation, that we are
Mhm.
alienated from a felt sense of God or the sacred in our lives. We are feeling alienated from our very selves. We're feeling alienated from one another. We don't have village community anymore, where one person's needs or joys are inherently resonating with us, because we are more
Mhm.
atomized in how we structure ourselves. And then we're also alienated from the natural world, and even classifying it as the natural world as opposed to like where we live and move and have our being
Right.
is a linguistic distancing that has occurred. Some speculate through the very development of self-reflexive consciousness itself, like the distinguishing between the I and the thou, that's happened sometime in the last 6 to 8 thousand years, and it created a subjectivity on the one hand, but it also created the alienation. And I feel like
Yes.
the task of healthy religion and healthy spirituality is a fourfold reunion, recommunion, and resonance is also a perfectly suitable word, a reconnection with spirit, self, other, and world. What are
Yeah.
the stories, the practices, the community forms that can have us actually feel this felt sense? Because to me, it's beyond ethics. It's not necessarily like I wake up each morning and say, how do I need to be a good person, even if I grit and bear it? It's like, no,
Yeah.
from a systems design perspective, how do we just design systems where being pro-social and being loving is the path of least resistance? It's what is rewarded
Mhm.
by our environment. It's what's rewarded by our circles. And it's what's rewarded by what's inside of our hearts. Like that would just be a much healthier way to live and
Yeah. I
stress.
like the way you put that. I'm going to go back though to your right relationship or resonant relationship with the world and its various dimensions,
Yeah.
and just share a little personally. Before we got on this call, I was talking about hiking, and I found I hike in the wilderness uh, usually at least once a week, sometimes more. And one of the things I find is that there's something psychologically healthy about walking through sagebrush or forests or along streams and rivers in which I still like to use the word natural world, because I use that word to say no human has manipulated those environments, at
Mm-hmm.
least not intentionally. Um, and there's something about that wildness
Yeah.
that, at least for me, is psychologically centering. And like I feel like I've gotten back in touch with how the world is, even though I know the world is also a world and that we manipulate and organize and you know, do all the things we do. But for me, the outdoor experience is really important for my psychological health.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate you saying that, and to, share equally personally. Like, I live in Western North Carolina. I live in Asheville, which is one of the most
Oh,
gorgeous natural landscapes, in the
yeah,
world. And we have the Appalachian Mountains here, and it's just beautiful. And oftentimes I'm still just on my daily grind, living, I could be living anywhere for as isolated as I can be sometimes. And recently I've been chatting with Aaron Simmons, who wrote Camping with Kierkegaard, and he's like,
yeah.
dude, we got to go mountain biking sometime soon, or go hiking. And he does that all the time. I'm like, yes, please, teach me your ways, get me outside more.
I got just yesterday got my bicycle out of the garage because it's getting to be warm enough here for me to bike and getting it all ready to go. And that's one of the things I like to do once the weather is good enough, is just bike back and forth between the coffee shop where I usually write,
Mhm.
just to be out in the weather a little more.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Many of us have access to that outdoors. Some of us do not, and that is also a tragedy.
Yeah.
But I appreciate these reflections on how we could actually help the cause of ecological healing rooted in our faith, rather than the way so many people use it as an excuse for their apathy or active extraction. So thank you.
Yeah, a couple winters ago, I was out in the middle of nowhere, sagebrush land, and I saw some movement by a creek, and it was kind of odd. And I walked over and I got close, and I realized I had come upon a coyote that was caught in a trap. Somebody had put a trap out there, probably to get coyotes and get their pelts during the winter.
Mm,
And and the poor coyote had his paw in there, and I decided I was going to try to get that coyote out of that trap.
mm.
So I talked to the coyote for a little while, got calmed down a little bit, got right up next to it and started working with this trap. And I could not get the trap released. I mean, I worked for probably a half an hour. I practically was crying. I was trying so hard.
Whoa.
And finally, I thought, maybe I need to leave this, go on the hike, think about it, and come back with a better plan. And I came back with a plan, and the coyote was gone.
Oh,
Apparently, I don't know if it got out itself or if the trapper got to it. I
oh,
think the trapper got to it because there were tracks around there. But anyway,
wow.
I share that story to say I care about the creatures of the earth. But when you're in a situation where you're actually face to face with a coyote and you're trying to release it from a trap, which is actually illegal in the state that I live in,
Mm,
you have a different sense of your relationship to other creatures, because you get to look at that creature right in the eye in its moment of need. And
yeah.
even though I couldn't be the savior of the moment,
Mm,
it had a profound effect on me as I think about the other creatures on the planet.
yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. Mm, yeah. And when thinking about other creatures back on the more human plane and the different faith creatures that exist, the third most
Oh,
asked question.
nice segue. I love it.
Thank you, thank you. Uh, is can I affirm the wisdom found in other faith traditions while being rooted and grounded in the way of Jesus? And one reader contextualized this a bit more, telling me that she grew up in a mainline denomination that she's still part of, mainline Christian denomination, but she's about to marry an atheist who was raised Hindu and wants a partially Hindu ceremony, and that she enjoys celebrating Diwali. So it's an increasingly practical and relevant question of how do we get along with our neighbors of other faiths and no faith, not just as an abstract matter of dialogue, but sometimes even in our intimate partnerships.
Yeah, it's an ongoing issue for me. I do identify as a Christian for a number of reasons, not just because of the cultural background I'm a part of, and not just because of the communities that I've been enmeshed in for over time, but
Hmm.
also because of the intellectual resources and ideas that I think uh, are likely more true than other ideas. Now, of course, within the Christian tradition I'm a part of, there's all kinds of diversity.
Yeah.
And it's only been in the last couple of years that I've realized I actually have more in common theologically with some of my Muslim and Mormon friends than I do with some of my Southern Baptist friends.
Yeah.
and
Okay.
and I said some in all of those instances because I'm not saying all Muslims think the same or all Southern Baptists think the same or whatever.
Right.
But I've realized that the boundaries for religions aren't nearly as tight as I once thought they were.
Yes.
When I took world religions classes when I was doing my schooling when I was younger, they usually presented them as, okay, here's a set of beliefs,
Yeah.
here's the set of practices, here's the tradition, this is Islam, this is Judaism.
Right.
And then when I actually got to hang out with real Muslims and Jews, turns out there's all kinds of diversity, just like there's all kinds of diversity with Christians as well.
Hmm.
So I'm no expert on religious pluralism, but I'm finding that intellectually there's a lot more. There's great greater overlap in the wisdom traditions,
Hmm.
and sometimes the wisdom of another tradition surpasses what I find in my own tradition, and I'm willing to embrace that. Let me give you an example.
Hmm.
Um, I'm a monotheist. I think there's one God, and that God is a God of love, who's a spirit at work in all of creation. My Hindu friends oftentimes have a variety of gods, and that makes no sense to me as a monotheist.
Hmm.
However, if I understand Hinduism as pointing to the multiplicity, the plurality present in existence of intrinsic and ultimate values, then I can incorporate that insight from the Hindu tradition, even though I remain a monotheist. So not all Hindus would like the way I just, incorporated it, but I think it's just kind of part of what it means to be a person of faith as you try to bring together all the ideas you discover or encounter that you think are, make sense of life. And if you remain committed to one particular tradition, as I am as a Christian, there's no reason you can't draw from other traditions and wisdom and wisdom ways of thinking. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well put. And I resonate with so many aspects of what you're sharing, both about how I feel more in connection with people from sometimes with other faith backgrounds than I do with my own co-religionists. And yeah, also how with like a bit of creativity and curiosity, elements of other people's faiths and religious traditions can help me illuminate my own commitments. And
Yeah.
I don't mean to
I
water it down, but there's just a lot I can learn.
yeah. I suspect my reservations with uh tra- religious traditions outside of my own have more to do with practical matters than they do with theoretical ones.
Mm.
Like, I don't like my Pentecostal friends who go to church for 3 hours. Like,
Mhm.
I don't want to do that. Give me an hour at max. I want to go on. So that's just sort of a practical thing. So I can imagine maybe some holidays conflicting. I don't know, much about these other traditions, but I can imagine in a family there might be some conflicts just because of the practicalities of
Yeah,
the practices or traditions and things.
yeah, yeah. It's true, and those would need to be navigated in the way that any other relationship, complexities are navigated.
Yeah.
So good thoughts here. Well, as we're wrapping up, I want to share a pair of more lengthy write-in questions that I had that are
Okay.
around the issue of human sexuality and faith, and they're coming from two opposite poles. The first one comes from a man named Bill, who asked me to not use his full name because he currently works for a very conservative evangelical institution, and I can hear in his question his own evolving thinking, but he's asking for permission for just how far he's allowed to evolve and still be faithful. So here's what he said. He says, "Hey Mike, I'm working with a friend who has a lifelong same-sex attraction. He wants to love and be loved, which includes the physical and sexual side of love. To this point, he's been celibate." And then Bill has the sense to note, it's killing him. He's a Bible
Mm.
believer, but he's been burned by well meaning church people informing him of his eternal destiny should he live out his attractions. So he's at the point of wanting to end the torment by ending his life because his attempts to be delivered from his attractions any other way have failed and his hope for the rapture has waned. I just want to pause there and say, could you imagine having your sexuality be so condemned by your community that you're actually hoping to be caught up in the air with Jesus as a way of being delivered out of that?
Wow.
So in his first, how he ended the first email he sent me, and there are two that I'm going to share from. He said, "Would love to hear your thoughts on how to minister, what freedoms he has before God to live out who he believes he is, etc." And when I, replied asking to, if I could, quote this for permission, he said, using a pseudonym, he elaborated, "As I've been trying to encourage my friend Nathan over the months, I wrestle with my counsel to him. Should I say, live out your attractions, brother? You are completely free. One reason for my cognitive dissonance is that I greatly respect the Creator's design of the human body, sex, procreation, the institution of marriage, societal stability, etc. I also consider my response to a hypothetical question. Bill, would you conduct a marriage ceremony for me? And then he puts in parentheses, yikes. So
Mhm.
Bill is, really wrestling with his own theological paradigms, but not nearly as much as his friend Nathan is wrestling, who's considering living his life. And while I think that, ideally it'd probably be better for, two cis hetero guys to not be responding to this question, here we are. And oftentimes and in a way, I'm thankful when I hear from my queer friends. They're like, I do not have time for this kind of question in my life anymore. Like, by all means, be the firewall to handle these really
Mm.
basic things. And so I think we should just lean into it with gusto. Tom, how would you respond to Bill here? What freedoms does should Nathan have, and what freedoms does he have to imagine a different form of God ordained expressed sexuality that is outside of his conceptions of what biology and institutions are for?
Yeah, there's so many things I could say to this. Let me answer by giving a brief summary of my thought and then give you some background to what brought me to my summary. So, my summary is I think Bill should feel free to uh, in, be involved in same sex relationships that are healthy. For me, healthiness in the sense of promoting well being, overall well being, that's the ultimate litmus test. And promoting well being is the same as loving. So, love in the sense not of sexual activity, although it can sometimes involve that, but love in the sense of promoting what's healthy, promoting well being. And I have no problem believing that people of same sex attractions or various queer orientations can live healthy, committed, loving relationships, even though their relationships are, you know, uh, queer. So, some background. Um, I don't know. You probably even don't even know this, Mike, but I'm currently being charged by my denomination for being queer affirming.
Oh no, I
Uh,
know that. Yeah,
you
yes,
did know that.
yeah.
Okay.
Let's say more
Uh,
for people who don't.
yeah. So I've been through a couple of hearings already. And then last summer, I was given an additional set of charges. I'm charged with teaching doctrines contrary to my denomination because my denomination has a stance on human sexuality that does not affirm same-sex sexual behavior. I'll just use the word queer here since there's such varieties there. It doesn't affirm queer behavior. Um, and I'm charged with conduct unbecoming a minister because I'm trying to get the denomination to change to be an affirming denomination. So I've got two charges against me, and I've written a long defense. And I heard just a few weeks ago from one of our general superintendents that I should expect the trial to be coming soon. Didn't give me a date.
Wow. Okay.
Uh, yeah. So needless to say, I've been thinking about this for a while to get me to the position I'm at now. I changed my mind on these issues, what in the old days we would just call homosexuality, and have that cover all kinds of things,
Mhm.
way back in the early 90s. And then I had to make a decision how I was going to live out that change of belief in a denomination, which is the Church of the Nazarene, which is fairly conservative on this issue.
Yeah.
And I've been trying to do that over the years, which involves also teaching my own children. I have three daughters to be queer affirming, although again we didn't call it that when they were younger and we talked about this.
Yeah.
Um, and after wrestling with all of the biblical passages that are brought to bear on this question, which is actually not that many that are specifically related to sexual orientation or sexual activity, after looking at the various historical arguments, which are not as clean and clear as some people would lead you to believe, by which I mean there have been queer people in the church and arguments made in favor of queer orientation and behavior.
Mhm.
After thinking about issues of human sexuality through science and philosophy, I came to an affirming position. And fundamentally, it's about what my answer is. That is, when we're trying to give advice to Bill about his sexual attractions and his desires, we have to ask the questions about what's healthy. And there's plenty of scientific evidence and anecdotal evidence that same sex relationships can promote the well being of those people in the relationships and their families and communities. Yes, it can be disruptive. Yes, it makes people have to change the way their expectations, but overall, there can still be overall well being promoted. So that's a long answer. Sorry, Mike.
No, no, I appreciate that and resonate with it entirely. 2 points of clarification. Bill was not asking for himself, at least not ostensibly, but for Nathan, his
Oh,
friend.
that's right. Sorry, I messed that up.
And you said something that I'm earlier on that I'm pretty sure was just a slip of the tongue. You were like, "This can be healthy even if it's queer love," and I would say that
Oh,
perhaps
yeah,
especially if it's queer love. I've
yeah,
so much from queer folks about love because their
right.
love often costs them more in our culture and society, and even beyond that, just so many of the creative and beautiful expressions that I've learned from my queer siblings. But
Yeah, thank you for correcting me on those.
yeah.
Let me add one other thing too. Um, One of the problems I think in the conversation is the word love. Um, for me, that's like probably the most important word in my entire life. It's the reason that I'm a Christian is the love issues.
Mhm.
But as we all know, it has a bunch of different meanings and people use it in all kinds of different ways.
Yeah.
Often in the conversation about sexuality, love has to do with sexual behavior. And in my way of thinking, sexual behavior may or may not be loving
Mhm.
because love primarily has to do with what's promoting well being or healthy. And we can all imagine sexual activity that's not healthy. Rape is an obvious example.
Mhm.
Um, so part of the problems I think that arise is the language we use. And I try carefully to use the word love to mean anything that promotes well being,
Yeah.
and then use things like sexual activity in the way that other people might use, loving others or whatever.
Got it. Yeah. I can see those being important distinctions. And for anyone who is, like Bill, looking to better minister to the Nathans in their lives, do you have resources you'd recommend? I believe you have at least one book about this. And then is there another book by another source that would be an accessible introduction to this question for people who are looking for sort of theological permission to be fully loving to their queer friends?
Yeah. I think kind of an introductory book that I like to recommend is by David Gushee called Changing Our Minds.
Mhm.
But the book that you mentioned that I did, I was actually a co-editor with my daughter,
Mhm.
is 90 plus essays from people in the Church of the Nazarene who are writing essays to try to get the denomination to change its views. Some of those writers are queer, some of them are scholars, some of them are allies, pastors, etc. So you
Mhm.
come at the essayists come at from a variety of different perspectives, but
Yeah.
that book has the unwieldy title of why the Church of the Nazarene should be fully LGBTQ plus affirming.
That is a bit unwieldy. And yeah, and 90 essays. Goodness gracious, you're such a troublemaker. No wonder they have you on a heresy trial.
Yeah, well, it's not just me, obviously. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this edited book is that
Yeah,
I wanted people in power to see that it wasn't a lone wolf or a lone voice. There's a growing movement, even in a conservative group like the one I'm in,
yeah,
that sees that we need to make changes.
absolutely. And yeah, in the show notes, I'm going to also put in a link to a post I wrote 5 years ago. It was an open letter to the United Methodists when they were considering this.
Oh,
And it has a number of resources, but another one I'll just name for this purpose is Jesus, the Bible, and Homosexuality Explode the Myths, Heal the Church by Jack Rogers, who I believe was a Presbyterian teacher. So, yeah, there are a lot of good resources if you are open-minded, open-hearted, but still wondering, what you have permission to believe in this regard.
Yeah.
Um, and then, finally, similar question, but from the opposite end of the spectrum, from someone who is queer. Um, Reverend Kat Katsanis Semmel, and Kat, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, who is on social media as at Kat, K-A-T, Katsanis, she wrote me and said, since you invited us to reply more in depth, I'm going to be sharing my biggest question. For me, it would be the one about embracing a church that has discriminated against women and LGBTQ plus folks. As a woman, as a queer woman, and as a married queer woman in a same sex marriage, I've had a lot of skepticism at best thrown my way. It has been shared by both religious people and non-religious LGBTQ plus people. She says in parentheses, religious LGBTQ plus people get it, but both religious folks and non-religious, queer folks are asking how she can simultaneously embrace Jesus, his church, and her various human identities. She said, I suppose my identities are disruptive to the status quo, or at least what it used to be, though I've never thought about it that way. I've only followed the impulses of my true self, which I know are connected to my maker, and then made authentic choices that emerge from that connection. And so it seems I live in a paradoxical reality. Even though my spouse and I worship at socially progressive Episcopal churches rather than the more rigid orthodoxy in which I was raised. So here's our question. So how, as a whole, can we continue to bring attentiveness, tenderness, and illumination to this paradox? How can women, especially queer women, embrace not only Jesus, who was a feminist by my reading of the text, but also his imperfect church that's part of a fallen world? How can we do so without being bad feminists? These questions are a big part of my life's work, and I lean into them each and every day.
Yeah, great question. This is the way I try to do it. I try to say, what do I think is the core set of notions in the faith tradition I'm a part of, Christianity? And my way of thinking, those core set of notions revolve around love, a God of love revealed in Jesus of Nazareth, who calls us to live lives of love, and that love is promoting well-being. There's a lot of other things that is part of the church in the present and in history that have gone against love, either because they were culturally conditioned or people were just sinful and evil. um, so I try to think that Christianity shouldn't be defined by those elements. And then let me propose something that's a little bit radical, probably for some people. And that's the notion that Christianity and every religion doesn't stay static. Religions change, including Christianity. And for some people, I'm not saying this person has to do this, but some people choose to stay in a congregation or a denomination or a religious tradition because they want to be a part of trying to change that tradition towards something that'll be more helpful for their children and grandchildren and the future generations.
Mm-hmm.
Other people, that's not their thing. So I'm not saying if you leave, something's wrong with you, but some people feel that kind of a calling, and maybe this letter writer feels that. Other people probably need to walk away from church and find another group that can give, some of the resources that they get in faith communities. But some of us, and I'm one of them, I'm trying to stay to change the church towards something that I think is more healthy.
I love that. I feel like I heard you just name like three alternatives. One being um, to stay in congregations and denominations who might be a bit more recalcitrant, a bit more closed off to some of the emergent realities of the full giftedness and beauty and liberative potentials in being a woman, which is wild that we even still have to say that,
Yeah.
and in being queer. Another option, which I feel like Reverend Cat here is exercising, is to be a part of churches that the previous maybe generation had to be part of that change. Even in the Episcopal Church,
Yep.
that was like a process that was underwent. And thankfully now, the children and grandchildren of the people who pioneered some of those changes in denominations like the Episcopal Church or the UCC or the Alliance of Baptists, which I'm a part of, have
Mm.
have done that work, and these can be a safe home base where surely there's always evolving that to continue to be done, but that the primary arena of conflict is not within one's congregation or denomination. And then the third option is some folks simply need to walk away
Yep.
from these forms altogether for their own sanity's sake.
Yeah, it's that last one, walking away. In this new book that Tripp Fuller and I have done, God After Deconstruction, in the surveys we took and in the books we read, there's so many people walking away from the church.
Yeah.
And we want to encourage that, at least in some situations, because that's the most healthy thing
Yeah.
that a person could do.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also another side of me that knows that we as humans need community.
Yes.
And so you would hope that folks who walk away can find community in some form or another, whether it's a religious community or not.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, Mike, but I'm finding many people struggling to find healthy communities after they've left the church. And on those people, I don't encourage them to go back to an abusive church,
Of course
but
not.
I say to myself, what can I do to help foster healthy communities? It may or may not have to do with religion for these people who are searching for a community of like-minded, loving travelers.
Yeah, it's such a salient question, because I have many friends who have deconverted from all forms of Christianity and either consider themselves atheists or consider themselves seekers of another tradition, or maybe generally spiritual but not religious. But they do look for other communities, whether those are like yoga studios or any number of other groups. And what I find for some of them, I remember a dear friend of mine who became an atheist and even became something of an atheist thought leader and communicator, just like he was when he was a Christian. And I think at first, like, the atheist world felt very shiny and new to him, and he had like a genuine hope that there weren't the same sort of abusive and crazy tendencies that he Christianity. Sure enough, after a few years, he was involved in some, the conflict, organizational conflict,
Yep.
fallouts, splits, and recognized there was still like sexism and racism in some of
Yep.
the communities. And he is not reconverted to Christianity as a
Yeah.
result. But I do think he has a more chastened epistemology with regards to what are the maladies that are unique to an institution being religious
Yep.
versus what are some of the features that are often happening that are common to being human.
Mm.
And I do think that when folks are exiting evangelicalism in particular, sometimes they're sitting ducks for like whatever other things are out there,
Oh, yes, yes.
which can be just as opportunistic. And I mean, this is a weird segue, but I really appreciate the work Ligare is doing. It's a Christian organization looking at helping people integrate psychedelic experiences that they've had on
Mm.
plant medicine. And
Hmm.
and part of and what they're wanting to do is they're wanting to take some of the healthiest aspects of congregational life and spiritual direction and apply that for psychedelic integration.
Ah, makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Because they see that there are a lot of these, if anyone listening is in the psychedelic world, you'll know this to be true. There are a lot of like kind of pay to play self-appointed shamans out there charging
Yeah.
you thousands of dollars to have experiences, and they may or may not be qualified to even oversee those experiences, never mind help you with a healthy integration. And so there's
Yeah.
a lot of predatory practices out there in the more general human potential and new age world, just like there are in some of the worst elements of evangelicalism. And there are
Yeah.
even some congruences and confluences between QAnon adjacent conspiracy thinking and nationalism between evangelicals and the sort of general metaphysical world these days. So
Mm, mm,
I
mm.
think that that's the bad news, right? Is like discernment is required in your post-Christian journey. It's not just something you needed for evangelicalism.
No,
There are a lot
no.
of unhealthy community forms out there. But the good news is there are a lot of healthy community forms out there too, certainly in different religious traditions, and wonderful spiritual but not religious people who are creating alternative models. But one of my enduring sadnesses as a communicator who, positions himself on, what Richard Rohr would call the edge of the inside, like, that I am
Mm.
involved in congregational life, I am involved in progressive and contemplative Christianity, is that one of the great undeconstructibles that people who leave evangelicalism don't seem to deconstruct is the evangelical teaching that theirs is the only true church, or the only legitimate expression of faith, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah. Well,
there's, yeah, go ahead.
I see something similar to that in that many evangelicals um, um, grow dissatisfied either with the Bible or with their church, but they cling to their desire for absolute certainty and a rock solid epistemic foundation, but
Yes,
they just shift it over to science or
yes,
something like that. And
right.
so they're still fundamentalists. They're just fundamentalist scientists.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and they agree with the fundamentalist assertions about what the Bible is and what church is. They just find themselves on the opposite side of that coin, saying
right. Exactly.
false. And so, yeah, like what I mean by that is that, I feel like there's sometimes just a direct evangelical to atheist pipeline,
Yeah.
because the people that are opting for atheism, when I say, well, have you considered like an emotionally healthy progressive church? Like, progressive churches aren't real churches.
Yeah.
Christianity is just watered down. It's not real. I'm like, where are you parroting that from? Was that what you heard from the evangelical?
Yeah.
And if you're willing to question, what you heard from that pulpit, all of these other matters, might you spend even a few months looking into it for yourself, that to see whether or not progressive Christians are real Christians or not? And if you,
Yeah, I get the same thing with my a non-omnipotent God. You know, it's either an omnipotent God or no God at all for many people, and they can't imagine that God isn't omnipotent. And yeah, so I can see that problem.
yeah, and I have a lot of empathy for it, because if you have a trauma response around the very trapping
Yeah,
faith, like going into a church building, seeing certain symbols, hearing certain words being said, then you might not have like the internal space for the very real differences in how a emotionally healthy, open-minded, open-hearted faith community is using that language and is forming themselves as a worshiping community. And so,
yeah, that's I have empathy too, and it's actually, I can imagine people reading this God After Deconstruction book and saying, look, Tom, the word God has done so much damage. It has so many red flags. There's so many traumatic experiences revolving around the G word.
yeah.
Why don't you let it go?
Mhm.
Why don't you just set it aside? And probably for some people, they have to. And I got no problems with that.
Yeah.
But my approach is to say, look, why give such an important central word over to the bad ideas, to the bad versions of it,
Yeah.
especially when the literature is showing, like the latest Pew research, that the vast majority of people who check none on their religious affiliation box still believe in God.
Mhm.
And people like Kathy Escobar and her research says that, the people deconstruct and they don't give up belief in God, they give up belief in the church or something else.
Yeah.
So why not, if people still have this intuition about the divine, some kind of transcendence, why not appropriate that in the ways of love and use that moving forward instead of just giving up on, again, some people probably do need to give up on the God word, but I think most people,
Yeah.
um, at least in theory, should be open to rethinking what God is about.
Yeah, I agree. I don't like giving up any words to their most awful proponents and saying,
Yeah.
because eventually, because if I come up with a different turn of phrase to describe what's cherished to me, eventually that one's going to get ruined too.
Right. There's no perfect word. Jacques Derrida helped us to see that. Yep.
Hmm. Well, so speaking of God After Deconstruction, as we close here, do you want to say a few words about both the book and the course that you're doing with Tripp?
Yeah, Tripp Fuller and I conceived of this idea about a year ago, and it's actually a project with three dimensions. One is a course that's currently underway. Tripp is managing most of that. It's a course that features 10 videos in which Tripp and I talk about the ideas in the 10 chapters of the book, and then also some live conversations during this particular month of April. And so, if folks want to be a part of that course, you can probably just Google God After Deconstruction and find a place to do that. It's a pay whatever you want kind of a thing. The second part of the project was the book that we've been mentioning called God After Deconstruction. And I took the majority role in that and wrote most of that. That just came out the start of April, which is where when we're recording this particular session. And I'm happy to say that today it's #1 on a couple Amazon categories. So a lot of people are getting copies, and that's
Beautiful.
obviously thrilling. And then the third part of the project are some live discussions. We did one at Drew Seminary back in February. We have another coming up in Denver, April 12 and 13th at Highland Ranch United Methodist Church. And you can find information on that if you want, if you go to Eventbrite and look up God After Deconstruction. We're going to do some things related to Theology Beer Camp in October, but we're open to doing more in-person events at various places around the country. So if some of your listeners think, hey, my church would love to host that, or my group would love to host that, we'd love to talk with you about that possibility.
Beautiful, beautiful. And yes, yeah, the course which addresses all 10 of the questions, not just the three that I paraphrased that we addressed today, can be found in the course. You can go to actually godafterdeconstruction.com to
There
find.
you go. Yeah.
Yeah, and it is a pay what you can afford. The book is out, as Tom is saying, and yes, the events are happening, and this should be released before this next one unfolds. So that's awesome. And then, yeah, of course, Theology Beer Camp in October. It's going to be so fun, and you will be there as one of the resident teetotalers. So
That's right. One of the few people who don't drink alcohol. That's
yeah,
I'll have my iced tea. I'll
yeah.
be brewing tea.
Nazarenes need to know that you still have the bona fides. Be like, look, I am on
Yeah, that's right.
a shot every year. And I'm the perfect, model of the Wesley Calvinist tradition as embodied by the Nazarenes.
That's right. I don't believe in omnipotence. I'm queer affirming, but at least I don't drink alcohol.
Maybe be honest, Tom, if you end up getting drummed out of the denomination, will I see a beer in your hand at a future?
I don't know. I don't think so. I don't have like an urge to do that, but I'm not against beer or anything like that. So
Uh,
that's not a big deal in that issue. But yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
right on, right on. And I also just want to note for the recording that there are actually recovery meetings that happen at beer camp as well.
Yes. Yep.
Everyone is affirmed regardless of whether you drink alcohol or not.
That's right.
So we have a lot of fun. But awesome, Tom. Well, thank you so much for taking time with me today to talk about these questions about God and faith that keep so many of us up at night. Really
Well,
appreciate it.
yeah, thanks for the opportunity. I really enjoyed the discussion, and hopefully something we said can be helpful.
All right.